Everyone, to Climate Conversations, which is an ongoing event sponsored by the Chelmsford Climate Action Team. We do it on the second Thursday of each month, usually at 1 o'clock, unless we have another evening speaker and we had changed that. Oh, and Jessie, if you want to go ahead and hit, okay, this program is being recorded just so that everybody is aware of that. So today our topic is native plants and our speaker is Jessie Panek. She had a landscape design company and is now retired. And she has, quite an interest in native plants and ecology. She's taught many classes about natives for the Native Plant Trust. And she also has led tours at their garden in the woods. And she has an extensive garden of her own in Harvard, Mass. So she's going to give her a presentation, and then if you all can put questions in the chat, I can aggregate those and ask her at the end, or there may be time for individuals to ask questions, but it's always better to put them in the chat in case multiple people have the same question. So I will turn this over to her now.
Great. Thank you all for coming or joining us online. This is wonderful to be able to do this. I hope you'll all learn some new things. I certainly have learned things in preparing the talk. That's one of the fun things about trying to teach other people, is you can almost always learn something new yourself. And so the first thing I'm going to say is that, as humans, we have tended to be a bit myopic, really. We focus on megafauna because we can relate to them. They're something like ourselves. Becoming attached to monarch butterflies is actually great progress, because now we are fond of an insect. Although I know it's risky for some people to admit that butterflies are insects. But that charismatic insect is opening the door to making people more aware of plants. So the question is, why should we think about plants? Why are we talking about them? Well, the answer really is because they can do something that we cannot, that other animals cannot. They have the magic of photosynthesis, and with the energy from the sun and water, they take carbon dioxide from the air and turn it into oxygen and carbohydrates in the form of plant tissue. Plants are basically essential to life on Earth, specifically to the flow of energy that enables life. Plants are the basis of all food chains. And most food chains, like the one shown here, include insects, because insects are a critical step in that transfer of energy from plants to all the animals that are not themselves herbivores. Now, this is a very important little piece that we'll come back to later. Today, we're looking at our native plants, but I'm not going to talk so much about how wonderful and beautiful they are and how we want to plant them, how easy they are to take care of, but rather why we need to grow them. First, we have to ask, though, what is a native plant? Oops, wrong direction. There we go. So many definitions are possible. They can be broad definitions, narrow definitions, and they can all be true. But like in many conversations, if we don't define a term the same way, we can end up with a bit of a disagreement. So let's try to define what we mean. Generally, it's agreed that a native plant is a wild plant that is growing without human assistance. But beyond that, a definition of native usually should include a time frame. On the left of this image, there's a ginkgo tree. Now, some say that this should be called native because, according to the fossil record, it actually was found in North America at some point. But is it really meaningful to say a ginkgo is native? On the right, I expect you all recognize the common dandelion. Now, it certainly grows everywhere and grows wild. And it's been here a long time, but it was brought to the colonies as a food and medicinal plant. Many people probably would call it naturalized, but not many would call it native because traditionally it was said that a plant is native to the United States if it was growing here before the colonists arrived, which you can think of as sort of the beginning of globalization. The point is that a native is a plant or an animal not introduced by humans, either intentionally or, as happens all too often, accidentally. So our definition of native should also say where we're talking about. After all plants are native somewhere, but what does it take to consider them native here? Of course, it depends on what here is. I don't think any of us are likely to call these plants native, but they are native to our Western Hemisphere. And this is a saguaro cactus. Most people would also say the cactus isn't native because it can't grow here, but it is native to the United States. Now, this is a coneflower, or Echinacea purpurea. Many gardeners in New England would call this native, but is it? It's found growing wild in parts of the eastern US, but not as far north as Massachusetts, even though it's completely hardy here. Now, as gardeners, we do tend to think of hardiness as the main criteria for where a plant grows, whether a plant can survive in our temperatures. Or maybe we're aware of soil pH as a characteristic that limits some plants. However, it seems there are many more complicated reasons why a plant is found wild in one area and not in another. In the past, botanists spoke of plants as being native to the US or New England or Massachusetts or Middlesex County or even a town like Chelmsford or Concord. But plants, of course, don't pay attention to political boundaries. So saying a plant was native was really a statement about what had been found in a given jurisdiction. It might exist elsewhere, but had not been documented there. Historical documentation is certainly helpful, but now we're really looking for a guide for the future about what plants ought to be in a given area in the ecologically disrupted world that we live in. When I started teaching at Garden in the Woods about native perennials, I used the traditional time frame of pre-colonial to define native, but for where a plant is native, the Native Plant Trust was using a relatively new geographic unit called an ecoregion. Now, this is a map of ecoregions here. Ecoregions are areas defined by a very diverse but carefully thought out set of criteria. Includes climate, vegetation, geology or soils, rainfall, the terrain, what wildlife is found there, how the land is used, and even human impact. In other words, they define areas with similar ecosystems. So this map shows the United States divided into about 10 broad areas, with each area sharing common ecological characteristics. But you can add or narrow the criteria to break down each of those 10 into subregions. As you can see here, this is level 2 of the ecoregion designation. I apologize that I can't line up the maps precisely. But you can see how these are nested inside the previous map. And then there's a level 3, what breaks the areas up even more into over 100 of level 3 ecoregions created by using narrower and narrower criteria. So plants tend to grow as part of a particular ecosystem, which can be very general or very specific. In other words, some plants will grow across an entire level 1 ecoregion, like the eastern temperate forest that we saw in the first slide, which was pretty much all of the East and some of the Midwest. But others may be limited to just a single, more narrowly defined, what we call a level 3 ecoregion that they'd never move beyond without human intervention. But one advantage of using ecoregions to talk about a plant's native range is that it tells you where a plant would likely be found, even if it hasn't been documented there yet. because the characteristics of the environment where it usually lives are present throughout that ecoregion. This means a plant is more likely to function in our local ecosystem if it's found wild elsewhere in our larger ecoregion. So a plant usually found in Illinois or Georgia may fit and have an ecological function here in Massachusetts, more than a plant from the Rockies or Washington State. Now, there's a great author you should know about if you haven't heard of him already. This is Doug Tallamy. He's a researcher and entomologist, and he has a definition for native that reflects this ecoregion concept well. He says that native is a plant or animal that has evolved in a given place over a period of time sufficient to develop complex and essential relationships with the physical environment and other organisms in a given ecological community. Now, this gives a functional meaning to the term native. It's not black and white, and it's harder to state categorically, this is native here, but not there, because our knowledge of ecological interactions is limited. But this definition might be much more useful to us going forward than a simple descriptive definition of what has been found in a place. Using this definition of native definitely helps with the next question I have for you, which is, why do we want to plant natives? And simply put, I'd say it's to restore and strengthen the complex and essential relationships involving plants that have evolved as part of the local ecological community. It's really hard for us to recognize just how tightly connected the biological world is, because we're very disconnected from it today. But it's become clear that it's much more complex than we ever dreamed. So popular focus right now is on pollination, and that's a good place to start looking at plant ecology. The most familiar pollinator that people are aware of and concerned about is the honeybee, which ironically is not native, but was introduced by Europeans for honey. And you can debate whether it fits with or actually interrupts our native ecosystems. My point is really that you should understand focusing on pollinators doesn't necessarily mean native pollinators. Large-scale agriculture imports honeybees in hives to have bees enough to pollinate a large number of flowers in a short time. And for our current agribusiness food system, that's essential. But for smaller scale farming and in nature, native bees do the job of pollination. They're actually more efficient than non-native honeybees. They can do this job because instead of a monoculture in a smaller farm, for example, there are many different plants which flower at different times, so resident bees have food throughout the year. We need our native pollinators, and not just for the production of our food. We need them because they are a key player in the life of 80% of all plants. The other 20% are wind pollinated. So native plants evolve with native bees and other insect pollinators to a mutual advantage. Since plants are literally rooted in place, they need help to exchange genetic material. Some use wind or water, but that 80% that depend on insects for help. To enlist their help, flowers make sure that insects, including bees, get a food reward of nectar or pollen when they visit flowers. So then they go on to similar flowers, expecting the same nice reward. In the process, at the next flower, they leave some of the pollen from the last flower, which enables fertilization and the development of seeds. When insects and plants found a good partner, they made that relationship even stronger and more inclusive. For example, an insect's tongue might evolve to be the perfect length for the shape of its preferred flowers. You can see the long tube or spur at the back of this flower, a native delphinium, where nectar is stored. So the bumblebee needs to be able to reach deep inside to get his reward. Now, not all pollinators are attracted by nectar, so not all flowers need to make it. Sometimes the pollen alone, which the plant needs to make for its own purposes, is sufficient reward. But plants have evolved to provide whichever their insect pollinator needs. But when we talk about supporting pollinators, we're not just talking about insects visiting flowers. Most insects' life cycle includes complete metamorphosis, with 3 or 4 stages in completely different forms, like this familiar butterfly metamorphosis. To support an insect that pollinates a plant as an adult, we must support it at earlier life stages. That means providing a place for the eggs to be laid and for the pupa to develop and plants that the larva can eat. Now, most everyone now knows that you plant milkweed to help monarch butterflies. It's a great PR program we've had. Monarch butterflies, however, can get nectar from many different plants, from many flowers, but the caterpillar can only feed on milkweeds. So their eggs must be laid on milkweed plants. A pollinator garden then must provide both nectar for the adult butterflies and what is called the larval host plant for their eggs. These are different for each species or genera. Fritillary butterflies, for example, need violets for their larvae. But again, the adult butterfly can feed on many different flowers. It's the larval stage that's the critical stage to provide for. Nature has a lot of picky eaters, and it's not just that they don't like to eat other things, they've actually evolved so they can't eat other things. It's not just caterpillars. It turns out 1/3 of native bees that feed on pollen can only use the pollen from certain species of flowers. Now let's go back to the fact that plants are the basis of all food chains. Many insects don't eat either pollen or nectar. A lot of insects are not pollinators, but they're just as important because they're part of that food chain. As adults, some of them eat other insects, but most eat leaves at some, if not all, stages of their lives. Perhaps you can see, I don't know what these bugs are, but in the left-hand side, you see those jagged edges. Those are where dinner has been consumed by these big black bugs. When it comes to leaves, plants and insects are not cooperating like they do with pollination. It's more like fighting a long war. Plants may develop thorns to prevent browse by grazing mammals, but what can they do about insects that want to eat them? Now, it's chemical warfare. To defend themselves, they create chemicals that are toxic to the insects that are eating them. This is really amazing when you think about how this can happen. But the insect needs to eat, so it evolves to tolerate those defensive chemicals. An insect species usually focuses on just one plant species, genera, or family that shares a defensive chemical, because it takes too many resources to develop a tolerance for the chemicals produced by many different plants. In this way, an insect evolves to be only able to eat a particular species of plant. Hence, we have the monarch butterfly, whose larvae can only survive on milkweed leaves. But this includes all the species in the milkweed genus, Asclepias, because they share the same chemicals. Although we talk about the monarch as if it was unusual, it's not. 90% of insects are specialists like this. Only 10% are generalists that can feed on most anything, or a larger number. So we need a wide variety of native plants to support a diverse population of insects, because most are specialized to either pollinate or eat one or only a few specific plants. But what happens when many or most of the plants are not native? Let's look at that. Doug Tallamy and his research assistants have made some really interesting observations in this area. They looked at our friend the chickadee. Caterpillars are the primary food that parents feed to their chicks. And the researchers learned that to raise an average brood of chicks, the parents had to provide 8,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to the nesting chicks. And the parents continue to feed them for 21 days after they fledge. That's a lot of caterpillars. And what do all those caterpillars eat? It turns out native plants were much more efficient at producing insect biomass, over 4 times as much compared to non-native plants, including 35 times more caterpillar biomass. That means they provided a lot more food for those chicks. And they supported 3.2 times as many different herbivore species. So native plants are much better at providing the food that chickadee and other birds and herbivores need. So eminent biologist E.O. Wilson said, insects are the little things that run the world, and explained in a 1987 article, so we've known this for a while, that if insects were to disappear, so would almost all flowering plants and the food web they support. Following that, he said, almost all of terrestrial animal life would go extinct and humans would be unable to survive. So it seems that maintaining our insect populations is a good idea, and native plants do the best job of providing food for native insects. Scientists still know so little about how ecosystems function that we often don't know which are the most critical pieces. You may have heard the metaphor of a plane where multiple rivets hold the wing on, and we don't know which is the really important one, whose loss will mean the wing falls off. That's to help visualize the idea of a keystone species that was promoted originally in 1969, that some species are more important or even critical to keep everything running in an ecosystem. Keeping all the rivets is maintaining biodiversity. Now, what would happen with many fewer species of both plants and insects? We don't know exactly, but we know that biodiversity creates stability, makes ecosystems more efficient, produces more biomass, that is, it's more productive, and is more resistant to invasion and disturbance. I think we would all agree that stability and resistance to disturbance are very important things in this age of climate change with its more destructive storms and weather extremes. Diversity, however, is helpful only when the species are contributing to ecosystem function. Just having a large variety doesn't make a difference. So a garden with many non-native species is probably not as good as one with fewer native species. Diversity allows redundancy, which is very important in ecological stability. Maybe there are 5 different insects that can pollinate plant X. Well, that redundancy enables that plant to survive and to live and reproduce, even if there are only 2 or 3 of those insects around. But with fewer pollinators, the risk is higher that you will end up with none. When you lose that last pollinator, you lose that plant species, and then lose all the insects that depend primarily or largely on that plant for food, and those insectivores that fed on those insects. Plus, you lose the plant seeds that provided food for small mammals and birds. You can see why E.O. Wilson's suggestion that it would be a cascade of effects would be true. Perhaps a Jenga tower is a better metaphor than the wings on a plane. In Jenga, when one piece is removed, the balance shifts and a different piece becomes most critical. So there's not just one keystone plant, the keystone plant actually changes. Ecosystems are constantly changing, and humans are removing pieces right and left. Unfortunately, it's a game with very high stakes. So what should we do? Well, as you can probably guess, the answer is to plant natives. But instead of focusing on just how to make our yard or garden pretty, we need to focus on making it both pretty and productive at the same time. Landscapes need to be hyper-productive to support the larger ecosystem. When you realize that much of the area around buildings and asphalt and lawns is not ecologically functioning, yards and gardens have to make up for that lost area. Second, landscapes need to support pollinators in all stages of their lives. Third, they have to manage rainfall to not let it run off, which requires plant roots to hold the soil and to absorb the water. And the fourth would be to capture carbon. Soils themselves, in addition to the carbon contained in plant tissues, could hold 7 times more carbon if we had enough plants to put it there. And we know that would be a good thing. So here are some guidelines for planting a garden that contributes to the ecology of your area. First, you can reduce the amount of lawn you have. Lawn is an ecological desert. What lawn you have, you should let it contain many species of small flowering plants like violets or dandelions. You don't need to have a pure grass lawn, which is a real desert. Second, no pesticides. Homeowners use more pesticides than farmers in the United States. And then we create the perfect setting for insect problems by having exotic plants, a lack of plant diversity, and using insecticides. Nature can do it better by herself. She regulates a balance which has been figured out over thousands of years. Now, here's an interesting point. To control insect herbivores naturally, i.e. the insects that are eating your plants, you have to allow some populations of the same insect herbivores to exist, because only if you have some of the insects will you also maintain a population of their predators. It turns out you can damage as much as 10% of the leaves on a plant before people will even notice. So we don't need to have perfect plants, especially if you're talking about trees where you're not staring at them from 5 feet away. Complexity in plant species provides a reservoir of predators. So when a new pest arrives, the control of it can be nearby. Basically, we must learn to tolerate some leaves being eaten. The real problems that can't be addressed by the natural system come with the new pests that are alien and disrupt that balance, like the woolly adelgid, spotted lanternfly, and emerald ash borer that have been in the news recently. Now, here's something I have to add. I think we need to understand that killing one type of insect, like mosquitoes or ticks, pretty much inevitably kills many species that you aren't trying to kill. So spraying your yard, even with so-called natural or organic chemicals, if it's effective against anything, it's affecting many things. I'm not minimizing the danger of diseases carried by these insects, but the way to responsibly protect yourself from biting insects is to protect your body with clothes or insect repellent sprayed on you. So continuing with the garden, let things be messy and clean up as late in spring as possible. What you see as a mess, some creature sees as home and food. And especially in our climate, wintering insects take a while to wake up in the spring and to start moving around. So we can't get rid of their winter residence too soon. In terms of designing a garden, you want a multi-layer or 3-dimensional design that, like nature has, with ground covers, with a herbaceous layer of perennials or maybe some annuals, your shrub layer, and then your tree layer, and maybe a low tree and a high tree canopy layer. Wildlife, which includes everything from insects and frogs to possums and foxes, need water, food, shelter, and a place to raise their young. You can help them further by creating brush piles for habitat. Next, let plants cover as much ground as possible. Use a living ground cover instead of barren mulch. There's an expression also of leave the leaves as a natural mulch and that overwintering habitat for insects. The birds will thank you. Also, be aware of and watch for the invasives plants and remove them. garlic mustard, bittersweet, Japanese barberry, many more, unfortunately. An invasive is a plant that pushes out other species that are part of an ecological balance without replacing its ecological function. We have some natives that you might think of as invasive, like poison ivy, but they still function actually pretty well in terms of the ecology. So they're not the bad guys. Next, you should think of planting in masses for pollinators, at least 3 to 5 of each plant species, because that way the pollinator gets more options to feed before having to go find another plant. You can also try to have at least 3 flowers blooming for pollinators in each season. So 3 for spring, 3 for summer, 3 for fall. Long flowering plants, of course, help you out there. You can also, don't have to be a purist or purge everything. You can use natives for the biomass of at least 70% of your garden. And Doug Tallamy thinks that that would be enough to keep things functioning. So your grandmother's iris are okay, as long as they're not the yellow invasive iris. And lastly, choose highly productive native species to support the extended food chain, especially those species that are most important for insect food. Across North America, 14% of plants make up 90% of insect food. Those are the most important species to keep the food web going. So if you can only plant one thing, Tallamy would say plant an oak. Nationwide, oaks support over 900 species of caterpillar. In our area, I think it's probably 400 or 500. But really, the list of what you should plant depends on your conditions. Let me say right now, I am worried by the glib generalizations you sometimes hear promoting natives. They say they need no care in your garden, you don't have to water them, they don't need fertilizer. Well, that is a bit misleading, especially statements that natives have no pests. Well, if nobody's eating your plants, the plants are not doing a job that they should be doing. And all plants need to be established with care after planting, and they'll grow well only in the right conditions, which resemble their native habitat. That is, a beach, a bog, a sunny meadow, or in the cool shade by a stream. If you have shade, you need to plant plants that do well in shade. Likewise, in a hot, dry, or sunny yard, you want plants that survive or even thrive in those conditions. A wet spot wants plants that like wet feet, etc. But after recognizing what habitat you have, what type of place you can make your yard, what natives should you consider? The ones that are the best sources of food for insects and other wildlife. We need plants that provide nectar, pollen, and leaves for food. And of course, berries and such for birds are another level of benefit. These are only a few of the species that I've listed here because you have lots of choices. But as I said, oak is certainly probably the top of the list. Willow trees, cherry and plum trees, poplars or aspens as we call them, birches, which includes a whole range of birches, not just the white birches. For shrubs, you might plant the chokeberry or witch hazels. Blueberries and dogwoods are other really good plants. And for perennials, there are definitely a lot of choices. Goldenrods and asters are some of the best. We were talking about goldenrods just before the class here started, and there are different types of goldenrods, some of which are very aggressive, but there are others that are much more single clumping plants and that will behave better in a garden without taking over everything. But goldenrods and asters in the fall are really essential. Violets are very important, as I said, for things like fritillary butterflies. All the flowers in the sunflower group, the Helianthus species. Wild strawberries, the leaves are very important for insects. Joe pieweed and boneset, the various geranium maculatum, the native wild geranium, the monardas, the wild bergamot. And then there's evening primrose and various rudbeckias, the milkweeds, of course, tickseed or coreopsis, something called mountain mint you may not be familiar with. If you think about how long a plant blooms, that's a good criteria for helping you decide on another plant. And mountain mint has lots of tiny flowers and they bloom over a very long time. So that's great for pollinators. And a few, excuse me, last hints. If you're a passionate gardener like me, you probably want to have some non-natives in your yard and garden just because they're beautiful. So here are a few more hints about selecting plants that might still be useful and function for the wildlife, even if they're not natives to our immediate ecoregion. Excuse me. If you're choosing a plant that's not clearly from our native or our local area, try to pick species from nearby, from somewhere within that larger ecoregion, which is basically the East or Midwest. Next, straight species, as we say, are more likely to function with wildlife or better than cultivars or nativars, as they're called, which are selections of our native plants. The nativars, that really is going to vary somewhat, depends on what they were selected for. And there are some exceptions. There's a phlox, a garden phlox called Jenna, which they did some studies, and Jenna has smaller than typical flowers for phlox, but the pollinators actually were more attracted to it than to the straight species. So there's always exceptions. You can also skip the double flowers because those have traded their reproductive parts, or the stamens, which have pollen, for more petals. So they can't have pollen and they don't have any function other than looking nice. And flower colors, you sometimes see, new variations of the flower color on a species. Well, other than white, which most species have their primary color, and then they'll have occasional white flowers. But those other colors are usually less attractive to insects. They're not used to looking for them. They're not trained, and so they just don't work as well. Finally, something that was definitely new to me, you should avoid selections that have red or purple leaves. Those have anthocyanins in them, and those actually deter the insects from eating them. So that's all I have for you today. But I'm happy to try to answer any questions, and I hope that you will enjoy gardening with natives. So, Anne, if you want to.
Yeah, so thank you for all the great information and the pretty slides. Very informational. So yeah, there were a number of questions in the chat. And just trying to see if any of them can kind of be grouped together. And some things you touched on. I mean, one person asked about, bordering on a woodlands where they really struggle to beat back the invasive species from there, like buckthorn. And, then what to try to replace those with. But I think you did touch on some of the best species. I'm assuming that would be like a partially shaded location. So do you have any particular like low shrubs or perennials that you think would be good for that problem area?
Well, in some ways, I think one of the important things to do when you're trying to fight back invasives is to cover the ground before they get there. So remove the invasives, and then don't leave the soil bare, because the bare soil it's a place where they're going to make it back in. Most invasives move most quickly into disturbed soils and much faster than our natives. So something that's going to cover the soil well. And actually, I was just thinking about, I'm sort of on a garlic mustard rampage. So, trying to think
time of year.
what you can do to crowd out essentially the garlic mustard. And I'm thinking, I think I may collect dandelion heads and take them and sprinkle them, down the roadside edge where the garlic mustard tends to move in, because they're not native really, but they certainly are not destructive to the ecosystem the way the garlic mustard is. And they seem to grow pretty well. So, that kind of thing, or a mayapple, which is a, very dense, low ground cover, might be a good one. But you're going to want probably to put some shrubs in, and those are not going to crowd out things as well. But again, putting in some of the native dogwood shrubs, or we have some really nice viburnums, the aronias, the chokeberries, things like that. There's nothing particular that I'd suggest. I'd suggest mostly just find things that will grow well where you are in terms of sun and shade and moisture, and get them in there. I would also mulch fairly heavily, even with a bark mulch, something like that. I mean, leaf mulch is great for ongoing plants and gardens, but I think the bark mulch has the advantage of you can really put a heavy mulch on, or even newspaper and cardboard, first, to try and create a barrier so that the seeds of the invasives that are probably still there won't have as much of a chance to sprout up until you've got some other things growing. It's also easier to pull things out of a good mulch.
Okay, well, that touched on another question too, which was how to manage garlic mustard, because I know that I see even on the Chelmsford like gardening and regular Facebook pages that's a topic on everybody's mind lately because it's blooming. But actually that also brings me back to something I thought of when you were mentioning about using ground covers as much as possible so that you don't have to use mulch as much, like bark mulch in some places. So what are your favorite like sort of fast spreading, densely covering native ground covers for?
Well, of course, deer are an interesting issue that affects some people's your choices in some cases. But the mayapple that I mentioned, I think the deer will not eat, because I'm experimenting with that one. I actually have a deer fence around my garden because it's so extensive, and I just couldn't keep up with the idea of fighting the deer for the rest of my life. But outside of that fence, I'm planting some mayapple in an area that's recently been resurfaced and needs to have some cover on it. I also really love the ground cover phloxes, the woodland phlox stolonifera and Phlox divaricata. There's the native woodland asters also. There's the white woodland aster and the blue heartleaf aster are both sort of partial sun asters that will they really create a nice dense mat. Especially the white woodland aster is a very dense cover. So those are some nice ones.
Okay. And thinking about actually ground cover, somebody asked a question about ajuga, but I believe that's not a native species. Is that correct?
It's not native, but it does have flowers that the bees love. And in terms of an alternative for a lawn, it's not really bad because I think of it as covering well, preventing erosion, which is something you definitely want to have something. And I think it's pretty tough in terms of being able to walk on it or to use it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Well, that's good to know because it's definitely in my lawn too. And I kind of like it, but I didn't know if I should feel bad about it or not. So,
well, you think about the alternatives. You do, for most people, you want some lawn, you want to be able to walk places, you want that kind of thing. And so it's what your alternatives are. And most of the grasses are not native grasses. So it's a question of what else can you use for a surface that's you can walk on across.
Okay, great. Let's see. Somebody asked also related to trying to repopulate their yard after eliminating some of the invasives, is can you transplant ferns well? Or I mean, I know you can buy ferns, but can you move them well?
Yeah.
Okay.
And ferns, when you're talking about something that creates a nice cover, this is not something a lot of people necessarily like because it's so aggressive, but the hay-scented fern is a really good ground cover. If you have an area, say along the edge of a driveway where it's going to run up against the driveway, you're not worrying about it spreading into a flower bed. And unfortunately, it seems to be able to coexist pretty well with poison ivy. So if you're trying to have an area that you don't want poison ivy, that's not so good, I found. But I'd say in general, that's a maligned plant that really is a nice plant. So I would definitely consider that. The other ferns don't tend to spread that vigorously. It's with the exception of ostrich fern in a very wet area, and they spread quite well. But they don't really make what I would call a ground cover in some ways, because there are these gaps between the plants. Now, when they grow up, they do cover the whole area pretty well, but they're tall.
All right. I want to get back to a topic that I think Juliana was touching on at the beginning when she was asking her question, and she also asked another question that kind of relates to that, is like how to kind of manage your native species that do tend to be a little bit aggressive compared to their neighbors, like the solidago, goldenrod, violets, and spiderwort, that, you know, will get a little out of control if you let them, and yet you still want them in your yard.
Right. I think it's hard to say, other than choosing your species carefully, ones that don't seed as much. You could deadhead them to prevent them from seeding quite as much, but of course the seeds are providing for other wildlife. So it's sort of a balancing act. You're trying to keep them from taking over, but you still want to have them. So deadheading would be one option. Picking species that don't spread as readily, or weeding. You know, I actually provide a lot of plants for our garden club's plant sales with seedlings, but that's a lot of work in a different way. But again, if they're really good plants, I mean, I'm delighted to see something show up. And it takes a more mature plant often to produce a lot of seeds. But yes, it's in some ways it's a nice problem to have, and the wildlife probably are very happy around Juliana.
All right. Yeah, I'm just looking through some of the other questions. Dave asked about planting a new tree, and you know how you spoke about how oaks are such a desirable species for such a good host. But if you already have a lot of oaks around, is it useful to plant another one if you're planting a new tree? Or should you try to pick, like, what's the next best thing?
Yeah, the list that I've seen talk about, as I say, the native willows were certainly some good options. The little pussy willow, Salix discolor would be something. But it seems that almost all of our large trees, you know, the birches, maples didn't get listed quite as high up from what I saw, but I haven't seen a lot of careful, you know, comparisons other than the oak, which came out so far ahead. But again, if you have a lot of oaks, I can understand, you know, you want to have some variety, because as I said, diversity allows other things, other advantages. So I think that the what they call aspen or poplar species are also good ones, but they tend to be more short-lived or smaller trees. So again, it's sort of what you're looking for in terms of a plant. And then there's the smaller trees like the dogwoods and redbuds are, again, not usually found this far north. I have sort of marginal luck with them in terms of dieback, but they're certainly for a smaller area. And interestingly, crab apples, I was reading that we only have a few native crab apples in this country, but they seem to have a very little difference in the chemical makeup of their leaves when you start looking at crab apples from elsewhere in the world. So they actually fit better, as I said, in the ecology of our area compared to other species where when you go across the world, they're really not compatible with the rest of our ecosystem. So that was an interesting one. Again, if you have a small area that you wanted a flowering tree in particular.
That's good to hear. I have a number of crab apples, and I was planning to plant more this summer, so I'm happy to hear that. I guess I would say too, I mean, it's important when you talk about maples to make sure you're getting a native maple, right? Because my yard is overrun by invasive Norway maples.
Maples.
And then of course you can get a lot of Japanese maples at the nurseries, but you're
right. And again, you know, if you know, one of the things I don't think it's really productive to be a purist. because you turn off a lot of people who otherwise might be willing to embrace a native concept in general. But the Japanese maple is usually a small plant. It's not usually a big impact kind of thing compared to a large tree. So I think the Norway maple is a whole nother problem. And to me, the challenge is there, say you have a very large established Norway maple and it's a beautiful tree. It's like, because it's producing thousands of seedlings all through the woods. And so as much as I hate to say it, I would think I would take it down and plant something else.
Yeah, that's good encouragement. I actually have like about 20 Norway maples, and I do spend my entire spring. That's my evil weed of,
maybe you want to
concern at this time of year.
Maybe you'd like to really thin your woods, as it were.
Yes, yeah. So we'll work on that.
Yeah.
I want to get back to, and I actually have to go in a few minutes, so then Bern can take over with residual questions. But maybe talking about insects, a couple of people had comments about, well, Julianne had noticed that her viburnums are blooming right now, and for some reason this year they're not buzzing with bees the way they normally would. And so if you have any insight on that, but also another semi-related question about whether tick tubes are an effective and safe way to control ticks without affecting insects that we don't want to kill, like the bees.
Yeah, I actually think tick tubes would be a good way of dealing with them. I can't speak as to how effective they are, but I think in terms of their negative effects, I think they would be very minimal. Because they're very focused. The way they work is that the mice take the cotton and use it to line their nests. So that means the mice don't have ticks biting them, which of course is good for the mice. And because it's very localized, it's not like it's spread across your entire landscape. And so I think that's really a pretty controlled way. It's like you're giving the mice insect repellent. It's not affecting a broad area. And what was the other part of that was?
Which just have you noticed that there are fewer bees this particular spring, or do you have any insight about why she wouldn't be seeing as many bees as normal on her viburnums?
No. I mean, it feels like it's been pretty cool to me, and bees actually often, are really most active when it's warmer. So I'd be interested, if they pick up as the week I think is supposed to be a warmer week. There's always a risk. It may be that if they were honeybees, it may be that someone who had hives near you doesn't have them anymore. Maybe the bears took out their hives, that kind of thing. It's hard to know specifically in one place what might affect them. But as I said, it's very interesting to think about how honeybees actually are affecting our native bees, because in some cases they may be displacing them by taking food from our native bees. But as I said, we need the honeybees the way our system is functioning right now. But I have not. I think to me last spring I didn't see a whole lot of bees either. I mean, it's hard to compare, year from year. But I don't have any insight, certainly.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, like I said, I have to go, but Bern is going to take over for any more questions. One thing I'll just say, thank you, Jessie, first of all, in closing, for a really good presentation and lots of useful information that I love. And my final comment will be, I will put in a big plug for Mountain Mint, which has been a huge success in my yard, and is at times swarming with like 10 or 12 species of bees and wasps at the same time. So it's a really amazing pollinator plant.
Yeah, it's very fun.
Fun. So I really enjoy watching that. Anyway, so carry on, everybody. I have to sign off, but thanks again, Jessie.
Thank you. I will mention, following on that, of other plants that I see just covered with bees. Another wonderful one is called Culver's root, or Veronicastrum. It's a tall, spiking white plant that also comes in a pale lavender shade, which seems to be pretty popular as well. And And then there's another, it's interesting what you start seeing as common things. Bugbane, or Simicifuga, as it used to be called, is also, seems to be very popular with the insects. So Bern, do you have a question?
So, I think Anne has brought up most of the questions that were in the chat.
Okay.
If anyone has any last questions, please enter them now.
You can unmute if you want and just ask directly if that's if you're at that point.
Okay.
Could I ask a question, Bern?
Sure.
Could you please talk a little bit about brush pile? I mean, I have a pretty big yard, but it's surrounded sort of by woods and areas that aren't developed, and I just have no idea what you mean by a brush pile.
Well, I think I kind of relate to what you're describing, because I also have a lot of woods around, and so that really applies, I think, a lot to places that don't have that kind of woodland reservoir. But if you had an area where prunings from trees or whatever like that, and you didn't feel like you had to clean it all up, you could just leave them piled. You'll see naturally in the woods sometimes, you'll see where a storm broke off a lot of branches from a pine tree and they just all sort of create a mass, a jumble. You think about it, it's an area that's more protected for animals. And it's an area that's not getting chipped or removed. So I think the idea is especially for places that don't have any of that mess in nature around. That's where it's especially important. You probably have natural piles like that, but you could, if you've got an area, off in the corner that it's convenient for you to just pile things as opposed to worrying about them. But I understand it's not always, it's sometimes you need the wood chips for a mulch or something like that. So there's reasons, but I wouldn't worry about that particular one.
Okay.
Creating it.
I sort of wonder about moving branches around in my woods. I mean, I go to the wetlands and I can't get into the wetlands, thank heavens, that's a good border. But I have lots of trees with downed branches, especially this year, twigs and stuff. So I wonder, should I put them in a pile? Should I just leave them? I don't know.
I would just leave them. Just leave them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions that people want to bring up?
I've got a couple. So we have in our yard a snag tree, meaning a tree with basically just a tree trunk with no branches. Up kind of like a telephone pole. And we kept it like that because we heard it was fantastic for birds and bugs. Would you recommend taking that down and replacing it with a keystone species like an oak tree? I'm trying to figure out what would be more beneficial to have there.
I would leave it for as long as it stands. The number of insects that will be living in that and the number of birds that can either make a home in it or feed on it is going to be equally important to anything else that you could do. Essentially, that's the natural process that you want to allow to happen. I do the same thing. I've actually had the funny experience of having a tree guy come in and having him take down the top of the tree because it was a hazard and leaving a trunk 30 feet in the air. And he's like, you really want to do this?
Yeah, that's exactly what we did too. Okay. So the alternative for us would be to chop it down and leave it as a log. So we wouldn't be removing it. Would it provide a very different function as a log or a less useful function, or how does that differ?
Again, my thought would be to simply leave it as long as it's not a problem the way it is. At some point you'll probably need to cut it down and because it will fall down. I'm presuming it's not going to fall in a dangerous way, and where you've got it. But my tendency is let nature do its own thing.
Okay, thanks.
There was one question about what to do about managing garlic mustard. Any ideas on that?
Well, I have actually been working pretty extensively with garlic mustard in the town of Harvard. And I can tell you that pulling it is definitely the way to go. if you have an area, this is a little bit sort of still people are trying to figure out, but from what I have learned talking to different people about it, say you have an area that's 50 feet long and 20 feet wide, and there's no way you can pull that garlic mustard before it goes to seed. You can take your brush cutter or your string trimmer, and I'm assuming this is a pretty solid area of garlic mustard, and mow it down as close to the ground as you can. And then 2 weeks later, go back and do it again. And do that a couple of times to weaken the plants. They may well come back next year, but you will have prevented all the seeds that it would have produced this year. So again, it may not be as effective as pulling it, but there's also the advantage that you're not disturbing the soil and bringing up more seeds to the surface, where, believe me, if there's a bed of garlic mustard, there's also seeds in the soil bank. So it's a way of trying to control a large infestation that I think would be successful if you can go back and continue to deal with it.
Do you have to pick up the trash that you generate? I mean, do you have to pick up those stems?
If you do it soon enough, if you do it now, in other words, they're still early in their flowering,
Right.
I suspect that you're going to get very few seeds formed from that. We tell people when they're pulling garlic mustard to bag it and put it in the trash, because that's the way of guaranteeing that, one, you're not going to get some seeds, some things that have already produced seeds. It's kind of like you're not able to address each situation individually. So it's like, as a blanket statement, put it in the trash. That way you don't have the chance of any seeds, and you also aren't having the leaves, which excuse me, which contain chemicals that actually deter other plant growth. It's one of the chemicals that they create, makes them, they're allelopathic, meaning they actually discourage other plants from growing. You can say that that if there's already a massive bed of garlic mustard there, you're probably not making it worse by leaving them there. And again, what's practical? So it's always a question of do what you can, but don't, if you can't do that, then, what you're doing is helping. If you don't get to it until the garlic mustard has already flowered and started to produce seeds, that would be a different issue. You might feel more concerned about collecting the garlic mustard in that case. And in any case, do not try to go in and cut it or deal with it once the seeds have started to dry, because then all you're doing is helping to spread the seeds. At that point, you might as well wait till next year, because you'll be disturbing the soil and spreading the seeds, which is, you're just helping the garlic mustard. So once you get to July, forget it. Don't even think about going in there.
So even if we pull it up now and a couple of the stems don't come up with roots, we're still doing a better job now.
Yes. And you're always going to lose some of them always are going to break off on you, no matter how careful you are. Yeah.
This has been so fabulous. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. As I say, I hope you learned some things. I certainly, as I said, I learned some things in preparing it, and that it's always a fun process to have to look up and dig into things a little more. And it's complicated. There's a lot of factors, and there's a lot we don't know. And so it's, and you're making, as I say, some hard choices in places, like whether or not, say you have small children and you have a yard and you don't want them getting ticks. And it's like, yeah.
Tick tubes.
Yeah, that tick tubes, but ticks, they're brought in by animals, and, there's a limit. But as I say, the best thing really is to keep them off the people. Don't expect to, and you can be inside if you want to make your yard into something that's barren and doesn't have any insects.
I have another question. We have some poison ivy that's coming in, and I know you mentioned that poison ivy is not an invasive species.
Right.
But how do we get rid of it without killing a whole bunch of the things around it? The only thing we've found so far is me going in with trash bags on my hands and uprooting them. But I'm horribly allergic to poison ivy, and I've gotten poison ivy every time that I've done it. So I'm curious if you have any better recommendations.
Yeah. The trash bags are interesting because, of course, they rip easily. Some really good gloves that come up on your arms, and a face mask, and really it's hard to do it manually. I will admit that I use Roundup sometimes, because I'm not horribly allergic, but I am allergic to it. And so I try to remove, if you have a larger plant, if you find a larger plant, you can cut the stem, like going up a tree, and paint the top of the stem, to kill the roots. And when it's on the ground spread over an area, it's certainly harder, and you're going to end up killing other things, whether you try to smother it with a ground, plastic, black plastic or something like that. So you might end up killing everything else anyway. So again, depending on the situation, you may need to use an herbicide to try to make things safe for you if you can't avoid it where it is.
I use a spray bottle and I target just the poison ivy, and that seems to work pretty well.
Yeah. You
a
can
hand
definitely
spray
be fairly precise. And if your sprayer isn't, sometimes you can adjust the nozzle on the sprayer to make it tighter. Yeah. But just, you're trying to limit your damage to other things, and certainly because poison ivy is really good at spreading, and it will tend to take over areas. It's a very good competitor.
Dave, do you know about Fell's naphtha soap for poison ivy?
Actually, is it like a black soap?
No, it's a bar soap, and it's in the laundry section of like at Market Basket or any grocery store. And if you use that within 2 or 3 hours, you won't get poison ivy. It's very strong bar soap, yellow.
Cool. Okay.
It's FELSNAPTHA, and it's in a green and white print paper wrapping.
Okay. Thanks.
There's also Technu you can get at the pharmacy. It's comes in a tube. It's got like little scrubby things inside to kind of abrade off the poison ivy. It's a lot more expensive than Fell's naphtha.
Yeah,
I think it works a little better.
I think that anything that attaches to the oil. So I think mechanic soap that they use, people who work with cars and get a lot of oil on their hands, those mechanic soaps are really good as well. I've read that the dish detergent, people were saying for a while that worked, and then I've heard people say no, that doesn't work as well. But I think the mechanic soap is probably another good option, which again would be less expensive than Technu. But obviously, not getting it on you in the first place is the first key. And so, another thing I've done is you take old socks and you cut off the foot, and you use this. This is actually for ticks as well as for poison ivy kind of things. You essentially create a sleeve, so that it covers that joint where your wrist is really vulnerable, to cover between your sleeve and your glove. But long gloves are a big plus to protect your wrists.
Okay.
But watch your face too. That's hard, because, not to brush anything against your face.
You mentioned painting the root. Is that what you said?
The top of the stem. So before the plant comes up, then where you cut it off, then you paint the top of the stem. Now, again, this only works when you're talking about like a big piece going up a tree when it comes to poison ivy. Most of the time you've got this huge long mass of stems poking up, and that's not practical there.
But tell him it's with Roundup. You paint with Roundup, not paint.
Oh yes, I'm sorry. Did I miss that?
No, you didn't.
I was thinking about getting some paint.
oh, sorry about that. Yes, I had in my mind that we had an antecedent there. No, with undiluted Roundup, or an undiluted herbicide, to paint the stem, and it absorbs it directly into the root.
All right. And is that a good way to target any invasive species? Like, I mean, not the poison ivy is invasive, but like if we see some bittersweet or something.
Yes, definitely. And the bittersweet and things like that, where especially when they have extensive roots, pulling them up can be very difficult, if not impossible. So yes, cutting the stem close to the ground and then painting with Roundup. And I believe other herbicides work as well, like trichlor.
And Jesse, what's that thing that twists and twists and twists around
That's
things?
bittersweet. That's
What is,
bittersweet.
oh,
Oriental bittersweet. It's horrible, and it produces millions of seeds. So even after you get rid of the big plants, you've got seeds for a long time.
oh. I don't
Do you
notice
have
any seeds.
do you have any recommendations for like lists of um, where or like a resource we could go to for specific plants to look out for removal in our area that
Oh,
like
sure.
bittersweet would be on this list?
Yes. If you do a search on invasives in Massachusetts in your search engine, you will undoubtedly come up with, I don't remember the name of, that there's some invasive control groups. The Native Plant Trust also has some resources or links to invasives. They were very early on the trying to prevent invasives with the database. But I can certainly tell you that the big ones, garlic mustard is particularly difficult because it produces seed after just those 2 years as a biennial. Bittersweet and as the vine, Japanese barberry, burning bush, depending on where you are, autumn olive is another big one. The list is actually considerably larger than the ones we see most commonly. They're trying to make sure they don't get planted still. Multiflora rose is a horrendous one because it's also really hard to get in there and physically deal with because of all those thorns, which keep the predators away. As I said, plants defend themselves, and barberry and the multiflora rose are both very effective that way, keeping us away.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. And a resource I just wanted to share with the group, I put a link in the chat to the nwf.org Native Plant Finder. And I found this to be an unbelievable resource where you type in your zip code and it tells you all of the native species for your area, and it sorts them by how many insects and birds they support. So right up at the top of the list is oak for the trees, and then it goes down to those other ones you're talking about. But it's like, I found that to be an unbelievable resource if people hadn't heard about it.
Yeah, that's good. Oh yeah, buckthorn is definitely. I found the chat. The buckthorn is hard for me too, because it's actually much harder to recognize than most of the other invasives, at least for me. And I do a fair amount of plant identification, but it's a little trickier. It looks different. It doesn't always come across looking exactly the same.
Okay, well, if there are any other questions, I think we should all thank Jessie again, and let her get back to her gardens.
That's right.
Or
Could I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Jessie, are there any landscaping companies that a person can turn to for help? If they have black thumb like me?
I think, I can't recommend any in particular. Again, it's going to depend on sort of, where exactly you are and what you're hoping to have done. It's really interesting. I should recommend to anybody, if you want a good book for more information about what I was talking about, it's this Bringing Nature Home. This is by Doug Tallamy, who is the author I was referencing a lot. And it's just, he's a great writer. He really knows his stuff because he's actually a researcher. But he talks about what they did at their property in, I think it's Connecticut, and just starting by planting small things. And I think it's a great sort of story of how he has worked with developing and observing what's happened, how nature has come back to his property, which was totally empty. It was totally like a stripped lot kind of thing. But in terms of people to actually help you with planting or choosing plants, as I said, there's a lot of resources out there. But if you actually need physical help doing it, that's a whole nother thing. But
yeah.
Do you do any
The
consulting
Native Plant
yourself,
Trust
Jessie?
certainly has a lot of information about plants in particular. And another not local website that I end up using a lot to look things up is the Missouri Botanic Garden website, is also a very, very good one.
Do you do any consulting yourself, Jessie? Like if someone wanted to have you come in
I
and say,
don't
hey, what's wrong with my
anymore.
garden?
It's one of those things. It's like, yeah, it's a lot of fun to do. But at this point, I'm focusing on a few other things. So
Okay, well, thank you very much again, Jessie, and it was really great to, I think all of us learned a lot, and let's give Jessie a hand and send her off.
thank you all. I enjoyed talking to you. So
It's great.
good luck. Enjoy your gardens, as I say. Enjoy your yards. It's a lot of wonderful things out there. So
Oh, I know what I wanted to ask you. I have violets in my yard now, but they're going to be mowed, but they'll come back, right?
yes, you won't really affect them that much. The good thing of they're perennials, and so they're going to stay there. But one of the interesting things I did learn was that if you mow less often, you're actually helping tremendously. And this was a really interesting thing. Mowing every 2 weeks was actually better than mowing every 3 weeks or every week. So there's something about the timing of things flowering that 2 weeks seem to be kind of a magical time frame. Now, I say it's very different in May or early June than it is in August. But in general, you don't want to mow your lawn too short or too often. You want to. It's better for keeping things growing if it's allowed to grow a little longer. But apparently, the interval of 2 weeks allowed a lot of things to flower, like the ajugas blooming now and the violets. The violets are often low enough that they manage to stay under the mower blades either. But violets are great in your lawn. I finally decided I'm not even going to try to pull them out of my flower beds, which I may regret in terms of talk about the things that take over.
Well, and we haven't had our lawn mowed yet, but I hope that they'll just go over it twice because I don't want them taking any of that away. I want it all mulched up.
Yeah, that definitely is good for the lawn to have fertilizer. It's free fertilizer.
Yeah. Thanks.
I think I saw Rick had his hand up for a while. Did you, Rick? No?
I did. I thought.
Okay.
I was just offering my applause. Thank you, Jessie.
Thank you very much, Rick.
For the leaves comment.
Yes.
So are there instances where you would want to remove the leaves so that things can not get smothered by the leaves?
Yeah, that's a constant juggling act that I'm trying to reconcile myself, because things usually will make it up eventually, but I'm not sure. So I sort of go around and like where they're really matted. I mean, the ideal would be in some ways to me to be able to, and this is what Garden in the Woods used to do. They took all the leaves off in the fall, shredded them, and put them right back on. But that way the leaves were there for the plants, and the insects and things. Of course, they probably, it's hard to know what insects were already there, shredding them. But as an idea, because it's the thick leaves like the oaks that don't break down very well, that I worry especially about just matting down. And if it's very wet, especially. So literally I've reached in and pulled up a clump and sort of shaken it a bit to try and loosen it up, and maybe some of them will blow off. And I mean, it's, you're always just trying to figure out how to deal with it. Or in some cases I've actually, taken a rake and tried to loosen them up a little bit, but not get rid of them, just trying to keep, because I don't want to lose the things that are struggling to come up. And of course it's not like in the woods. In the woods, you don't have as many plants, and hey, some die. We don't want that in our garden.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
With that, I think we are done now.
Okay.
Jessie, I think you've got the magic button that'll turn us all off.
Oh, okay.
So,
all right.
and also
I was just scanning through the
Jess at the library.
Make sure I had everything that was covered there. But
thanks very much again. We really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you all.